We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! This is Jinchūriki and I'm back again with another new series. This is what if Naruto conquers his inner demons. When Utakata discovers that Yagura is being manipulated by Akatsuki, he flees the hidden mist with the goal to save himself and his only friend. His solution? Find the other Jinchuriki and convince them to join his fight. But the Jinchuriki have more baggage than just the Bijū they contain, and if they can't create a cohesive unit from broken recluses, they may all be dead. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 1, The Slug's Escape. As a child with a growing aptitude for the shinobi arts, it became a habit for Utakata to sneak out of the compound belonging to Kirigakure's bubble users and simply explore the outside world. Harasame didn't like him being out, a consequence of being the Jinchuriki to the six-tailed slug, most likely, and it was within the nature of children to be curious about that which they were prohibited. The gray stone walls of his living quarters were as much a prison to his inquisitiveness as they were to his body. It was an expedition to one of the Land of Water's many inland lakes that 8-year-old Utakata met the hidden mist's other Jinchuriki. The other boy was shorter than him, with messy gray hair that blended into the fog prevalent throughout the hidden mist. Just by the boy's physique, Utakata guessed himself to be older, but there was a rigidity in his stature that was unbecoming of someone so young. "I know you're there," the boy said, startling the six-tails Jinchuriki. His voice was soft but matter-of-fact, carrying only the barest inflection. Surprised and curious, there shouldn't have been a way for this younger stranger to notice him from his hiding spot. He approached the shorter boy and sat down beside him. His too large kimono served as a makeshift blanket for him to sprawl upon. "How'd you do that?" "No, I was there," he clarified when the boy didn't respond right away. "Isabu told me." "Isabu?" The boy nodded. "The sanbai." Utakata gaped. "You're a Jinchuriki?" He appeared pensive, pupilless pink eyes finally acknowledging the brown-haired boy. A long, stitch-like scar trailed to his jawline from beneath his left eye, giving him the appearance of having undergone facial surgery that had never healed. "So are you, Rokubi Jinchuriki. How'd you know that?" he asked, taken aback by the boy's strange perceptiveness. "Isabu again." The boy returned to staring across the lake. "Isabu and I are on good terms. He's the closest thing I have to a friend." There was a long pause in which Utakata was unable to find the words to mask his surprise, and the boy continued, "Also, you gave yourself away by admitting you know what a Jinchuriki is. I have no peers who comprehend the concept." He directed his gaze elsewhere, as if hearing something no one else did. "I have to go." As the gray-haired boy turned to leave, Utakata reached out a hand as if to grab him, 100 questions fumbling for control of his mouth. The other Jinchuriki stopped, recognizing the attempt for his attention, and the older boy finally managed to ask, "What's your name?" "Yagura," came the reply in that same soft voice, and then Utakata watched him disappear into the mist. Utakata fled. Unlike most renegades, who typically ran on foot, the brunette was floating in a large bubble camouflaged to blend precisely with his surroundings, the open sky. He was immensely thankful for the calm, if chilly and overcast, climate that pervaded the Land of Water. It made his escape from Kirigakure easier and gave him plenty of time to think, time which he desperately needed to organize the chaos of his mind. Part of it was related to who he was, or more specifically, what he contained, but the other part was based on his very abrupt decision to leave the hidden mist. He needed to put as much distance between himself and the village as possible to get ahead of the hunter-nin who were sure to be sent after him. It was better to make their inevitable chase as difficult as possible, especially considering he already stood out far too much for his own liking. While he knew it was smarter to abandon the cornflower blue kimono which distinguished him as one of Kiri's rare bubble users, it and his black sweatpants were the only clothing that could withstand the Six Tails gift, the physical marker each Jinchuriki possessed in some form. The orange strips woven into the hems of the kimono's billowing sleeves and the orange sash cinched around his waist denoted him as a journeyman, one step below the red-sashed masters. Not that he ever would have reached that stage even if he had stayed in Kiri. Despite how rare it was for a Kiri-nin to possess an affinity for bubble-line ninjutsu, Utakata's status as the Rokubi Jinchuriki precluded him from ever rising to such a prestigious position. People feared the fallout of having a second Jinchuriki in a position of authority. Never mind that, throughout his entire life, Utakata had never harbored a grudge against his village. Fear of the six-tailed slug within him, and the three-tailed demon turtle within Yagura, seemed to override rationality, deluding people into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Saiken, as the demonic gastropod had introduced himself, had been in Kirigakure's possession for nearly half a century, and Utakata was only his second Jinchuriki. The original host, a man whose name Utakata had never known because he had died when the Bijū's resealing had taken place, had discovered a talent for the then unknown branch of Suiton ninjutsu and had eventually taken the fighting style to its peak, even starting the special training for those with the bubble line affinity. Like his predecessor, Utakata excelled at the manipulation of bubbles, earning his official place among the bubble users years ahead of the other shinobi. Unlike the ninjutsu's human originator, however, the brunette had grown up in a time when Kiri was recovering from an assault by its other captive Bijū, the three-tailed demon turtle, and there was a new stigma to hosting one of the tailed beasts. That Yagura was both the Sanbai Jinchuriki and the Mizukichi would probably have worked in his favor if the gray-haired boy had remained as soft-spoken and benevolent as he had in their youth. At least now he had an explanation for why his friend had changed so drastically. Utakata's head broke the water's surface. The cavernous hideout was supposed to be known only to the Mizukichi and the 7 shinobi swordsmen, but Utakata knew of its existence courtesy of Saiken. The cave, ironically, had been the giant slug's home prior to his capture by a young Kirigakure decades ago. Utakata preferred the cold dankness of his prisoner's former home to the stone pathways of the bubble user's compound, where the chill in the air always seemed amplified by the other occupants' silent disdain. Visiting also gave him the sole semblance of a connection to his father, the former wielder of the twin thunderswords Kiba, who had perished during the Sanbai's attack when Utakata was only 2 years old. Sometimes the brunette liked to imagine his father grinning at the other swordsmen, sharp teeth bared in a smirk, feet propped lazily on the circular table they conferred around. Voices reached Utakata's ears, and he hunkered down in a nearby corner, apprehensive of being caught by whoever was in the cave. Kiri's ninja, particularly the 7 shinobi swordsmen, were not known for their compassion or understanding, and he preferred not having to explain himself. When his blood finally stopped pounding in his ears, the conversation he was inadvertently eavesdropping upon became clear. Apparently, intoned a young yet apathetic voice all too familiar to the brunette, Yagura rarely sounded like he was interested in anything anymore. Kyomogakuure possesses both the nibi and the hachibi. There was a muffled sound, the impact of something heavy hitting something soft. Utakata guessed someone had just hit someone else. How reliable is that information? Asked another person, the voice striking both a chord of familiarity and a sliver of fear within Utakata. The reputations of the 7 shinobi swordsmen, alive or dead, loyal or not, preceded them. You should know better than to doubt my methods, Kisame, replied a deep voice. The Rokubi Jinchuriki couldn't repress the shudder that ran through his body of its own accord, the malice in the man's tone seeming to reverberate and amplify in the cavern. There are no secrets from these eyes. Ha, so you decided to actually show up this time, eh? Kisame noted mockingly. Some things are best tended to in person. What's the plan, then, Mizukichi-sama? The swordsman drawled, placing sarcastic emphasis upon the title. Utakata was surprised to hear the third man speak instead of Yagura. Nothing for now. We're still too unprepared to deal with this new information. There was a brief pause before he continued. In the short term, I think that it will be best if you pretend to stage a coup against Yagura so that you can work full-time for Akatsuki. As you wish, Mizukichi-sama. This place was gettin' kinda boring anyway. What are you planning to do next? Yagura has proven to be a convenient puppet. I'll stay here to keep my influence over him and continue to use Kirigakure's resources for our benefit. Surviving your coup attempt will further cement our control here. Utakata reeled at those words, his body slackening in shock. Yagura, the leader of the Hidden Mist, the only other person in the village who understood the burden of being a Jinchuriki, his friend, was being controlled by some stranger who was dangerous and most decidedly ill-intentioned. Distracted, he nearly missed the man continuing. Besides, it'll be much easier to monitor the Sanbai and Rokubi from here, and possibly discover the locations of the remaining Jinchuriki in the meantime. I trust that you'll monitor Akatsuki's progress in my stead and report back to me. It may be a while yet until we're ready to extract the Bijū, but I am a patient man, and I will wait however long is necessary to see our world realized. The phrase "extract the Bijū" echoed in the recesses of Utakata's blank mind, filling every nook and cranny. He didn't know for what purpose Kisame and his partner sought the Bijū, but extracting them would have only one result, the deaths of the two Miss Jinchuriki. Cautiously, so that his presence would continue to go unnoticed by those who plotted his demise, he edged backwards to the water. Calling upon Seiken's chakra, he readied himself for the arduous swim ahead. The alkaline properties of the Rokubi's power coating his skin would make his transition from land to water seamless. Gurgling resonated from deeper in the cave, and Kisame's voice mused, Seems like Samahata senses something. Utakata took that as his cue, slipping into the water as fluidly as an eel and sluicing desperately through it for the surface. With miles between himself and the hidden mist, his bubble floating over the ocean separating the land of water from the eastern shore of the land of fire, the Rokubi Jinchuriki could finally consider his situation with a clearer head. The talk between Kisame and the unknown man had revealed the danger of remaining within his own nation. Beyond that, if mention of the Nibi and Hachibi was any indication, Utakata could safely extrapolate that all the Jinchuriki were in trouble, not just him and Yagura. Not that any of them were as important to him as the Mizukage, but it was interesting. Unfortunately, despite his desire to rescue Yagura from the clutches of the unknown man, he knew he had nowhere near the strength required to do so. Kisame, apparently, was at the man's disposal, and the swordsman was one of the strongest inhabitants in the whole of the hidden mist. Not that he was even needed. If the unknown man was powerful enough to manipulate the Mizukage, host of a Bijū, then he was clearly more than capable of fending for himself. Hence the golden-eyed boy's flight from Kirigakure. He had no doubt that his status as a Jinchuriki, and thus a valuable asset to the island nation, if not to the evil man, meant that he would be hunted by the Oinin as soon as his absence was noticed. So I need to avoid the Oinin while training to get on Kisame's level. Then I might have a chance of freeing Yagura from whoever's controlling him. He hung his head, morbidly grateful that the despondence weighing him down didn't affect his drifting bubble technique. Easier said than done. In spite of his young age, Utakata was a skilled jonin, but Kisame was in a league of his own, and training while on the run sounded complex. Utakata sighed. I need help. Even admitting that to an audience of himself was painful. Utakata was used to doing things on his own, to finding contentment in solitude, especially after Yagura had become Mizukage, and the idea of finding aid for this mission seemed both impossible and unnatural. Sadly, the pragmatist within knew that he would never survive the challenges ahead without assistance. Conveniently, those who might be most receptive to aiding him would simultaneously help thwart the plans of the unknown man manipulating his friend, the other Jinchuriki. In theory, the remaining demon containers would have enough power to overcome whatever obstacles he would have to face on his journey to rescue Yagura. Not only that, but they needed to be warned that they were in peril from a group comprised of what he could safely assume to be immensely powerful shinobi. What was that group's name? Akatsuki, I think. That sounds about right. Regardless, in a perfect world, he could convince the other Jinchuriki to join him on his quest and they could fight the threat together, watch the others' backs, and ultimately save Yagura. As likely as that is. Utakata knew the idea was a long shot even as it came to mind, but his options were limited, and no other reasonable alternatives were coming to mind. They were the only individuals he thought he had a marginal chance of convincing to join his crusade. Self-preservation was a strong motivation, after all. Either way, that plan depended on actually finding the other Jinchuriki, which was no mean feat. Hidden villages were cagey with their secrets under the best of circumstances. Trying to locate their human weapons would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Yagura's in Kiri for the foreseeable future, and the Nibi and Hachibi are in Kyomo, he mused, ticking off his fingers for each accounted Bijū. Unfortunately, Kyomo's rather militant tendencies coupled with alliances made during the Shinobi World Wars, Kiri with Konoha, and thus against Kyomo, meant that Utakata would not be warmly welcomed in the village hidden in clouds, or even in the land of lightning as a whole, fugitive or not. Another sigh. So that leaves, what exactly? Momentarily stumped by his lack of knowledge, he racked his brain for some clue he'd overlooked until the story of the Kyubi no Yoko came to mind. Harasame's world history lessons had never seemed more relevant than in that moment, and he tried to recall every detail he'd been taught. The nine-tailed demon fox had rampaged through the hidden leaf a little over a decade ago, appearing seemingly from nowhere. It seemed to be generally accepted as fact that the fourth Hokage had ultimately sacrificed himself to kill it, but Utakata knew he could discount that as a rumor. Thanks to the Rokubi, the bubble user had access to information other people didn't. For a start, a Bijū could not simply be killed by a mere human. Aside from harnessing the power of the Bijū for mankind's own purpose, it was the main reason Jinchūriki had come into existence in the first place, and one of the chief reasons the Bijū were commonly taken from their older hosts and resealed into younger ones. Unless some masterful strides in sealing techniques had come about over a decade ago, or some convoluted geopolitics were at play, there was only one possible conclusion. Konoha had a Jinchuriki, a jail for the nine-tailed demon fox it didn't want the rest of the world to know about. He took a moment to muse over that revelation. If the Hidden Mist, Leaf, and Cloud villages all had Jinchuriki, it was probably safe to assume that the other five great shinobi nations, the Hidden Rock and Sand, had at least one Jinchuriki as well. It wouldn't do for 3 of the 5 great nations to have a tailed beast and the other 2 to not. Besides, with the 1-, 4-, 5-, and 7 tails unaccounted for, Utakata was almost guaranteed to find at least one of them within Iwa or Suna. Still, the Hidden Leaf was closer and rumored to be more tolerant than any of the other villages, not to mention that the Kyubi, with the most tails, was likely to prove most beneficial to his cause. His decision was made. To Konoha it is. Why do things never seem to work for me? Utakata thought with an annoyed scowl as a stream of water popped his drifting bubble technique. His former life in Kirigakure was proof of that. Though his mother had died in childbirth, his father's status as one of the 7 shinobi swordsmen meant that Utakata was a child of interest to the Hidden Mist's hierarchy. Unfortunately, that status, and his father's death, had made him ripe for consideration when the first Rokubi Jinchuriki had sustained a lethal injury in the Sanbai's assault on Kiri. The brown-haired boy had long ago accepted that, logically, the decision had been a sound one, though it hadn't stopped him from growing up disillusioned with his role in the Hidden Mist. He possessed such potential, the legacy to become another of Kiri's kenjutsu masters in his blood. But becoming a Jinchuriki had stripped him of that opportunity, and Utakata had instead received the distinct impression that he didn't belong. When he'd eventually brought up the bubble user's strange treatment of him with Saiken, the slug had spoken of their deference for the original Rokubi Jinchuriki, further confusing the brunette. Their contrasting distaste of him had only isolated him further in a village already disinclined to form attachments. Utakata could understand their reverence for the man who had started and inspired an entire sect of shinobi. He could appreciate it better if he'd been granted even a modicum of the same decorum. Scorn, he had learned from life experience, was not unfamiliar to Jinchuriki. Of course, it probably hadn't helped that it had taken a number of years to understand and control Saiken's unwanted gift, with interactions in the interim having interesting results. That he'd been stuck wearing the man's specially made clothes to help contain said gift probably didn't endear them to him either, painting him as a wolf in sheep's clothes. As a child, a small part of Utakata had always hoped that the bubble users would eventually accept him, but when it became apparent that his master Harasame was the only one who would give him the time of day, that hope faded with his youth. Their apathy was marginally better than the slanted looks and snide whispers the rest of the Hidden Mist's population graced him with. The Sanbai's attack had, unsurprisingly, left an unfavorable impression of the Bijū and those associated with them. The one saving grace of his life had been his early friendship with Yagura. Not that he thought he deserved that anymore. A better friend would have found a way to stop the mistakes of his fellow demon container, the bloodline purges and divisive civil war, the fragmentation of the 7 shinobi swordsmen, the continuation of the barbaric academy graduation ceremony. And now Utakata knew why everything had gone so terribly wrong, why their friendship had faded upon the younger boy's ascension to Mizukage. Yagura was being manipulated. The uncharacteristic, merciless orders Yagura had given while acting as the yondaime had been in stark contrast to the quiet, gentle child the brunette had befriended. Now that he knew Yagura hadn't really been behind any of those orders, it felt like a weight had been lifted off his chest. His friend hadn't really changed at all. The knowledge didn't assuage the guilt he felt at letting his friend be manipulated, his inability to get close to the Mizukage notwithstanding, but now he had a chance to rectify his mistakes and change both their futures. His friend was in trouble, and the bubble user would do everything he could to protect him, no matter how difficult the situation he got himself into turned out to be. Which brought Utakata back to his original thought that things never really worked out for him. He fell gracefully through the Land of Fire's canopy, noting the quartet of hunter-nin arrayed below him. It's only been a day, he groused. Yagura, or the mysterious man controlling him, had, unsurprisingly, dispatched the Oinin to track him down and subdue him. They likely hoped the fall would debilitate him, but Utakata reacted quickly, pulling out his bamboo bubble blower and unleashing a stream of bubbles he used as stepping stones to reach the forest floor, kimono billowing out at his back. Suetun, Hamitsu no Jutsu. He thought upon landing, twisting on the balls of his feet. Innumerable bubbles flowed from the bamboo weapon, creating a wall of translucent spheres between him and the mist shinobi. With a snap of his fingers, the bubbles exploded into a thick smoke screen that pervaded the immediate vicinity. Time to make my escape. A whip of water lashed around his wrist, and golden eyes went wide. Stupid. Of course they'd bring a sensor. You're distracted. He focused on the joint, releasing the chakra there that he'd trained to act as a second skin. The thin whip touching his wrist disintegrated, his skin's natural acidity dissolving the fluid restraint enough to wrench his limb free. Unrestrained, Utakata immediately brought his blower to his lips again and expelled another slew of bubbles. They popped under an incoming hail of senbon, bursting into sticky green slime that captured the needles and gummed up the surrounding forest. Utakata took advantage of the momentary respite and fled on foot, no destination in mind except away. The Jinchūriki's mind raced as fast as his body, every move performed automatically to give him freedom to think. Whatever sensor they'd brought along was likely to pose a significant problem for his escape. If the Oinin followed him, they would know that his destination was Konoha. He'd have to switch strategies, at least temporarily, and simply make it look like he was putting as much distance between himself and the land of water as possible instead of having a specific destination in mind. Once he was sure he'd lost them, he could double back to the hidden leaf. He angled northwest into the land of fire, hindered slightly by the unfamiliar terrain. It would only get worse as he kept moving, and a ninja wasn't good unless he could adapt. He was dead otherwise. NNN. Consciousness returned slowly, though not without consequence. A painful throbbing boomed in his head. Oh, Tunbi, I think he's waking up. Golden eyes snapped open, and Utakata sat up, the sheet pulled over him crumpling at his waist. His back ached, and when his hand instinctively flew to soothe it, a sharper pain flared in his shoulder. Shit, please, you shouldn't move too much. The Jinchuriki focused on the girl kneeling beside him, wavy blonde hair framing concerned green eyes. In the doorway behind her stood an older gentleman in his 60s, by the brunette's guess. What? He tried, but the remaining words seemed stuck in his throat, dry from disuse. Here's some water, the girl offered. Utakata gulped the liquid down. The older man, Tunbi, stepped into the room and over to the brunette. He looked as if he wanted to push the jonin down into the futon, but something was stopping him. You should rest. You'll be safe here. It's the least I can promise for rescuing Hataru-sama from those shinobi. Rescue her? A frown settled over Utakata's lips as he reclined, his initial panic assuaged. That didn't sound like him, especially given his fugitive status. What happened? He wondered as his eyes closed. Suetun, Suryuden no Jutsu. Utakata's yelp of commingled surprise and pain turned into a gurgle as the water dragon bullet technique slammed into him and drove him against a tree. A knot dug into his back, and a low branch pierced his right shoulder from the force of the attack. With his dominant arm out of commission, the renegade fumbled for the bubble blower tucked into his waistband. Before he could reach it, a long length of wire spooled around him from behind, trapping him against the tree trunk. A mild electrical shock coursed along the metal, momentarily paralyzing him before he could move. Taicho, we've got him. Utakata looked up at the shinobi who'd spoken, furious gold glaring at a porcelain mask. We'll see, he thought, preparing to release the chakra holding the Rokubi's gift at bay. Suetun, Mizurappa. Utakata gagged on the wild water wave, brown hair hanging lank in his eyes. Keep him wet, ordered another Oinin. Otherwise he'll escape again before Taicho gets here. Someone knows what he's doing. Saiken, one moment. What are you carrying? Some girl. She was in the way when I was getting set up. Utakata tilted his head to get a better look, finding the second Oinin carrying someone with a head of blonde hair under his arm. The two mist shinobi seemed distracted by their conversation, so the Jinchuriki again prompted, Saiken? The Rokubi's red-orange chakra oozed from his pores, melting through the wire and the trunk at his back, eliciting surprised shouts from the pair of Kirinin. He fell backwards, dodging the water jutsu that flew in his direction. Bubbles dribbled off his chakra cloak and floated towards the hunters, each one carrying a greenish tinge. Both mist shinobi countered with more water, and Utakata expelled his own sickly-looking Mizurappa. Where the two techniques collided, cascading droplets ate away at the forest floor's detritus. More bubbles floated off his body, adding to the plethora surrounding the pair of Kirinin. They summoned a torrent of water that crashed into the Jinchuriki just as the brunette snapped his fingers. The bubbles exploded, acid spilling over the pair while the great waterfall technique washed Utakata away, diluting the six-tails acidic chakra. Drained by the sudden loss of Saiken's strength, Utakata lay prone on the forest floor, distantly aware of a blonde-haired body beginning to get up from where it had been tossed away during his attack. Then there was nothing but darkness. Utakata awoke with a jolt, breathing shallow. He sat up slowly and brought a hand to his head, wincing as his shoulder protested the motion. Quiet snuffling nearby drew his attention to the now familiar head of blonde hair, the girl, Hataru, he recalled, asleep beside his bed. Gingerly this time, he stretched his good arm across his body to check his wounded shoulder. Frayed pieces of bandages lingered around the area where the tree branch had pierced. "We tried to wrap your injury," Utakata started at the gruff voice, turning to see Tunbi walking through the doorway, "but every time we tried, the bandages dissolved." When he was close enough, he presented his hands to the brunette, burn marks marring weathered skin. "I'm sorry about that," he offered quietly. "My ability, it's not intentional. I can't control it when I'm unconscious. It should be safe now." Tunbi knelt beside him, dipping a fresh towel in the bowl of water by his bed and using it to wash the blood from the Jinchūriki's back. Utakata flinched away from his touch. The older man furrowed his brow. "Does that hurt?" Utakata decided that pain was a believable excuse. "Yes." Tunbi nodded, as if understanding the teenager's reticence. "Ah, I see." There was a long pause before he continued, "I wish to offer you my sincerest gratitude for protecting Hataru-sama. She is precocious, and I cannot say what would have become of her had you not arrived in time." Utakata didn't respond, watching Hataru while the older man cleaned and bandaged his wound. It would be unwise to reveal to his hosts that the Oinin had been after him, not her, the blonde a mere bystander caught in the crossfire. Since it seemed they didn't know who he was, bringing any unwanted attention that might reveal his identity was out of the question. Hataru stirred beneath his gaze, opening sleepy green eyes and staring blearily at the Jinchuriki. "Oh, you're awake. Thank you so much for saving my life. Yagura," Utakata said. The name fell automatically from his lips, a reminder of who he was fighting for. Green eyes sparkled with adoration, any sign of sleepiness dispelled. "Thank you, Yagura-sama. If you don't mind, would you please teach me to fight like you?" Utakata's brow furrowed in confusion, sharp eyes analyzing the girl bowing before him. He'd never been propositioned before, in any sense, given the propensity of others to avoid him, and vice versa, and the mere suggestion was baffling. Users of the bubble line ninjutsu were rare in the hidden mist, and even among them, only he could manipulate the corrosivity of fluids. That, useful or detrimental, was a talent all his own, granted to him by the Rokubi. Mentally, he shook his head, even while his physical body continued to observe the prostrate form of the blonde with all the mobility of a statue. What could I teach her? He mused, a dark-humored sense of self-deprecation tinging the thought. And where would I even begin? To say that he was uncomfortable with human interaction was an understatement. Despite the village's shortcomings, Kiri at least had prepared him well enough for a life as a weapon, not a person. And besides, what use was some unskilled girl to his mission? Even trained by him, Hataru wasn't a Jinchuriki, and certainly didn't appear to offer any sort of benefit to his cause. She'd apparently been caught completely unaware by the Oinin, which, while not unexpected, didn't exactly inspire confidence. No, there was nothing he could do for this girl. Still, the words that escaped his lips were, "maybe when I've recovered." That, at least, wasn't guaranteeing anything, and would hopefully allow him the time to heal. In the meanwhile, there was no reason not to accept their hospitality. He offered Tunbi a thankful nod for his aid, sparing a glance for the clean wrap of bandages around his shoulder. "Oh, thank you, Yagura-sama. Is there anything you need?" "I'm fine, thanks." He closed his eyes once more and leaned back. "Come, Hataru-sama, we should allow him his rest." Utakata allowed his tense muscles to relax into the futon when the pair's footsteps indicated their exit from the room. Subterfuge was not a talent of his, given his relative isolation in Kiri, and the mixture of lying, fleeing, and socializing was getting to him. How long he would last under Tunbi's watchful eye and Hataru's inquisitive gaze was a crapshoot. Eventually, those stressful thoughts faded to the background of his mind, and the Jinchuriki dropped into slumber. Utakata cursed, dodging to avoid a stream of water and turning briefly to blow some bubbles at the pursuing Oinin. A quick snap of his fingers exploded the floating spheres, and he used the momentary diversion to speed up, golden eyes scanning the landscape for a sign of anything that could aid his flight. The vast emptiness of the dry land of Earth greeted him, offering only the occasional boulder as respite. I was better off in the land of demons. At least that had some semblance of shelter and water. Of course, anything he'd found in the territory west of the elemental nations had paled in comparison to the treatment he'd received on Mount Katsuragi, but after a week recuperating in the presence of Hataru and Tunbi, he'd run out of excuses to delay training the blonde. Faced with the inevitable confrontation, he'd instead slipped out of their home late at night, silent words of gratitude and apology for the pair echoing in his thoughts. Karma apparently existed, however, for he'd not only gotten lost in the dark, but another Oinin squad had quickly picked up his trail and driven him from the forest to the desert. From there, he'd managed to disappear into the land of demons, shoulders still throbbing and only natural poultices to treat it. That had been 2 months ago, and now, healed, and with almost 4 weeks of silence from the hunter Nin, he'd, foolishly, thought it safe to journey to Konoha. A whistle of displaced air was the only warning he had to dodge before a long, thin sword, essentially a giant needle, with a line of wire tied around the eye at the end whizzed past him. The weapon looped through the air in complex patterns, its trailing wire creating an impassable, latticework web. Utakata stared at the makeshift barrier, dread pooling in his stomach. They didn't. The sound of his name spoken from behind by a high, reedy voice forced the brunette to turn and face his growing nightmare. For Kirinin stood before him, the leader, an abnormally tall shinobi with a mane of straw-colored hair surrounding the standard Mist Oinin mask. Long, gangly limbs and a lithe body gave the hunter Nin an almost spider-like quality that was complemented by the coil of wire looped around one arm. Kushimaru. Courier Kushimaru was the head of the Oinin and the best capture and retrieval specialist the Hidden Mist had to offer, his title well-earned and aided by the legendary Chodo Nuibari. That a man of Kushimaru's caliber had been sent to bring him back meant that Kiri was done playing around. "You're coming with us," Kushimaru announced. The aptly named sewing needle returned to his hand. "You can come willingly, or we can have some fun." There was a hopeful lilt to his reedy voice, an ill-disguised wish for his prey to choose the latter option. They planned this. They backed off to rendezvous with Kushimaru and lure me out. Golden eyes darted around, seeking an escape. None presented itself. Smart. Well, I'd hate to disappoint. His bubble blower rose to his lips. As the first bubbles escaped, one of the Kirinin flanking Kushimaru flashed through hand seals, a thick mist springing into existence on the final one. A drizzle accompanied the haze, and the brunette's attack dissolved into individual water droplets. Kira-same, could this get any worse? Kushimaru dashed forward then, Nuibari swiping at the Jinchūriki. Utakata barely blocked the attack with his blower, momentarily stunned by the blow, and the swordsman pressed his advantage, beginning an intricate series of slashes and jabs. With the man's taller frame and longer reach, Utakata could feel himself instinctively withdrawing from the fight when Kushimaru suddenly stopped his assault. The Jinchūriki was only allowed a second of confusion before he felt wire tighten around him, binding arms to his side and legs together. He winced as the wire bit into his body deeper than necessary for restraining purposes before the swordsman announced, "Raitun, Jibashi." Ah! The electricity coursing along the wires stopped after several seconds, and Utakata fell to his knees, gasping for breath. He unleashed another scream as Nuibari pierced his side and emerged out his back. "You chose poorly," Kushimaru informed him happily. "The Mizukage is tired of your insubordination." Another electric shock ran along the wires, eliciting more pained cries from the brunette, though that paled in comparison to the defeat weighing on him. Yagura! The fact that the hunter Nin thought their orders were from the actual Mizukage rankled, but it was drowned out by a flood of guilt. "I failed." He struggled to summon the Rokubi's chakra to slip out of or dissolve the bindings keeping him in place, as Seiken's power typically allowed, but it merely flared and then dissipated. Kira-same, the mist rain, nullified most of his techniques, including the Bijū's chakra, and the short fight with Kushimaru had sapped both his strength and hope. The months of hide-and-seek combined with the resonating internal mantra that he'd failed suddenly seemed to catch up to him, and he collapsed fully, body prostrate on the hard ground. As his vision blurred and his eyes closed from a mixture of exhaustion, blood loss, and electrocution, Utakata thought he felt a faint rumbling from deep beneath the earth. Then there was rocky debris, a pillar of red liquid, a searing heat. The last thing Utakata knew before blacking out was his bonds loosening as the Kirinin scrambled against some unknown force. Chapter 2, The Monkey's Skepticism. Before it happened, people would address him with Kun or Dano when he passed in the street, delighted to be in the presence of the Tsuchikage-to-be's son. He was respected, and many considered him a potential candidate for the Tsuchikage position whenever his father eventually decided to retire, even considering how young he was. After it happened, People scurried away from him and were silent in his passing, unsure how to address the change he'd undergone despite nothing really changing at all. When his brother was born, the citizens appeared visibly relieved, his brother the true, eventual, heir to the Tsuchikage title. He blamed Mu, he blamed Inoki. But most of all, he blamed the four-tailed monkey sealed within him for how everything had changed. It was the cluster of gray clouds that caught his attention. Rain was sparse in the land of Earth, but when it did come, it was typically torrential and widespread. Skirmishes were less uncommon. Iwanin always seemed to be chomping at the bit for a fight, but when they did occur, there certainly wasn't any water involved. Either way, he was used to ignoring such fights. They didn't concern him, and he saw no reason to interfere with the business of others. Life was easier that way, not that he could really remember a time when life had been easy. Then came the flare of chakra. It was brief, barely lasting a second before fading away, but it forced him to focus dark eyes on what he'd hoped to give no second thought. Despite lacking any sensory abilities, that chakra called to him, resonating with something deep in his core. The tinge of familiarity was enough to get him running for the battle, brow furrowed and a scowl on his lips. I ain't fightin' another. His hands flew through seals as he approached, the power of the earth and its molten center at his fingertips. Yotan, Yogen Kanketsusen. A geyser of lava erupted from the ground between a fallen form garbed in blue and several figures wearing ANBU masks. It melted through the wire restraining the blue-clad figure before fading completely, the chakra feeding it dissipating in the drab weather. He inserted himself between the ANBU and the unconscious boy as the lava geyser technique disappeared, summoning chakra to function as a layer of lava over his body. Hisses erupted as his lava armor technique was pelted by water droplets, effectively dousing it despite the weak drizzle. Red eyebrows furrowed together in confused disapproval. That shouldn't happen. Dark eyes searched the assembled ANBU, focusing on the one in the back with his hands held in an unusual position. Your problem. Streams of water flew at him from three directions, and slabs of rock rose from the ground to shield him in a crude lean-to formation. Lightning blasted along the earthen barriers, reducing them to rubble and revealing only empty space. Find him and kill him, snapped a reedy voice as he reached up from beneath the ground and grabbed a pair of feet. It only took a moment to activate the double suicide decapitation technique, the targeted ANBU now a mere head above ground that was quickly severed with the curved blade of his kunai. As soon as the head rolled off the submerged body, the clouds began to disperse and the accompanying drizzle faded away. He spared a glance at the ANBU mask that stared sightlessly at him, snorting with disdain when he noted the symbol of four curvy lines on its forehead. Kiri. Shoulda guessed. Kirigakure no Jutsu. A thick fog rolled in from nowhere, cloaking the area in an impenetrable haze. He tucked the kunai away and remained still, waiting. While effective, he'd learned from past battles that practitioners of the mist's silent killing techniques always approached the enemy. And, as even they well knew, sight was not always a requisite for lethality. Little tremors in the earth warned him of an impending attack, and he whirled on the spot, grabbing the approaching mist ANBU by the neck. His lava armor sprang to life, a roiling coat of red-orange fire. The Kirinin managed a gurgled scream before his throat was cooked, flames engulfing his head before spreading across the rest of his body. He released the burning corpse, the heat emanating from his form burning off the hiding in mist technique and revealing a third shinobi, hands flashing through seals. Doton Keke Doro Domo. Earth rose around him, enclosing him in a dark hemisphere. A smirk sketched itself across his lips even as his chakra was slowly siphoned away. Ya think ya can trap me with earth? Stupid. Fingers curling into fists, he punched the wall of the earthen prison. Doton, ishi no hari. Dirt exploded outwards beneath his touch, tiny pieces of debris speeding in the direction of the Kirinin. The barrier collapsed seconds later, and he meandered over to find the mist shinobi's body riddled with the projectiles from his stone needles technique. Ichen. Then something sharp pierced his spine, and a high-pitched voice crowed, "Gotcha." His earth clone crumbled, and the Kirinin spun to block his lava-covered fist with a weapon that could only be described as a too-long needle. It surprised him when the metal weapon didn't deform under the intense heat of his lava armor, and his adversary capitalized by planting a foot into his chest. He grunted beneath the blow, skidding backwards, though the mist shinobi's hiss as he made contact tempered the ache. Nuibari's no ordinary weapon, the ANBU told him, pride lacing his reedy voice even as he gingerly set his foot on the ground. He cocked his head to one side, a magpie examining an interesting curio. Though the same could be said of you, HM? A bark of laughter escaped his throat unbidden as he eyed his opponent. "Yeah, don't know how true that is," he thought sardonically. As short as he was, the other man probably had 2 feet on him, his limbs unnaturally long. The way he spoke and carried himself suggested that he was on another level compared to the 3 deceased Kirinin. Don't matter. Yotan, Shakagaryagen no Jutsu. The needle wielder stuck the point of his weapon in the ground, hands flipping through seals. Suitun, Suijin Hiki. A wall of water erupted from below, intercepting the balls of molten rock hurtling towards him. The Kirinin laughed. "So, you really are a Yotan user, eh? Been a while since I killed one of you. Should be fun." Silence greeted this proclamation, and the mist shinobi appeared to grow disheartened. "Not much of a talker, are you?" "Yeah, talk enough fair th both o' us." "Fine then," continued the taller man. "I guess I'll just have to make you scream." Decision apparently made, he picked up Nuabari and rushed forward. The Iwanin parried his enemy's slash with the pair of kunai he'd sheathed within his armor, the long weapon sliding along the curved blades of his knives with a metallic screech. He aimed a kick at the taller man's knee, but the Kirinin merely used his weapon as a pole and vaulted around it in a semicircle, slamming 2 water-shod feet into his head. Steam formed at the point of contact and he skidded sideways, momentarily disoriented. "How much can you take?" taunted the mist shinobi. He rose to his feet and glared back before inhaling, chakra gathering in his chest. "More than ya can give." Yotan, Yoryuden no Jutsu. A dragon formed of lava roared from between his lips, flowing towards his adversary. The Kirinin danced away from the attack, managing to look graceful with his gangly limbs. He threw his weapon with casual ease, electricity coursing along its length, and the Iwanin dodged to avoid getting skewered or shocked, ignoring it as it sailed past. Then the Anbu pulled on the trailing wire, and something heavy collided with the lava user's back. He grunted at the impact, stumbling under the sudden weight. A brief peripheral glance revealed it to be the corpse of one of the other Kirinin, wire animating his body like a marionette. More wire looped around the pair in a loose cage. Chodo Ninpo, Kaminari Ori. Bolts of lightning converged on him from the surrounding wire, filling the sphere-shaped prison with blue-white electricity. He gritted his teeth against the assault, but a low growl of mingled pain and frustration slipped past his lips despite his best effort. The shrill, amused laughter of the mist Anbu sounded from nearby, and he squinted his eyes open with a scowl. Though he couldn't see beyond the bright lightning cage technique, he still heard his enemy cackle, "So you can talk after all. What else can you say? Come on, scream for me." Pain and frustration finally boiled into anger. "You're messin' with wrong guy." The Kirinin stopped laughing and managed a surprised, "Huh? Yotan, Kakazan." Magma exploded from beneath him and rained down hot and viscous. From where he stood at the center of the eruption, waves of lava flowed outwards for hundreds of feet, hardening into dark pumice as the seconds passed. His ragged breathing eventually evened out, hot temper cooling with the release of the fruit flower mountain technique. "Damn," he muttered. "Let bastard get to me. Stupid." Dark Eyes looked around, taking in the results of his handiwork. "No Bijū, though, guess I missed him." Sticking out from the pumice was the long sword the Kirinin had referred to as Nuabari. Despite the wire, and the body it had been animating, burning up under the heat of his lava, the weapon appeared undamaged. Employing minor elemental manipulation, he plucked it from its resting place and admired it up close. "Nice prize, at least." He shouldered the weapon, catching sight of a spot of blue outside the limits of the pumice. "There ya are." Approaching the unconscious form revealed him to be a teenager with brown hair and pale skin, only a slight flush providing any evidence that he'd been near the heated battle. Using Nuabari, he speared the nape of the boy's kimono and began to walk away, dragging the body of the Kirinin along behind him. "This thing's all kinds of useful." Utakata woke with a groan, opening bleary eyes that were greeted by the setting sun and darkening sky. He was lying on his back, a rock pillowing his head. His body felt bruised and dusty, like he'd been pulled over a hard surface a long distance. Most surprising was the fact that he wasn't trussed up like a pig and being hauled back to Kirigakure. "You're awake, eh?" mused a gruff voice. Utakata tried to sit up and turn his head in the direction of the voice, but a figure was suddenly kneeling over him, and steel was resting at his throat. Golden eyes stared down his nose to spy the curved blade of a strange kunai held against his neck. How about ya tell me what Akiri Jinchuriki's doing all way out here, eh? Utakata's gaze flickered to focus on the face of his captor. The man possessed shaggy, bright red hair that followed his jawline and was shaped into a short, pointed beard accompanied by a mustache and a high ponytail that jutted up in back. A prominent black strip of something, some weird birthmark, the brunette guessed, ran across the bridge of his nose and over his cheeks, disappearing beneath a tri-pointed headpiece crafted of brown leather. A golden ring dangled from the left side of the headpiece, a metal plate etched with Iwa's symbol of two overlapping rocks displayed across the forehead. Despite his intense curiosity, and considering the precariousness of his situation, Utakata figured it was best to answer the man's questions. I left Kiri some time ago. The Oinin chased me here to capture me. What happened to them? Dead, grunted the older male, didn't want to take chances. One with giant needle was annoying, but you're real threat. Kushimaru. If this man had really killed Kushimaru, and Utakata had no reason to believe he was lying, considering his current situation, then he was a force to be reckoned with. How'd you know I'm a Jinchuriki? I know a Bijū's chakra. Utakata gave that vague response a moment of thought before slowly asking, are you a Jinchuriki, too? It would explain why the Iwanin hadn't killed him even though he was considered a bigger threat than Kushimaru, because then he'd have to deal with fighting the freed Saiken. It also made the kunai at his throat a little pointless, but it was probably best to play along. Plus, that strange black strip on his face could easily be some Bijū's mark. He took the older man's silence as confirmation, inwardly thrilled at his turn of fortune. Excitement bubbled in his chest, and he continued, this is great. I'm looking for the other Jinchuriki. The blade at his throat dug in, breaking skin and cutting off whatever else he was going to say. Why's that? Growled the redhead, dark eyes flashing. Kiri got plans fair Jinchuriki. I told you, I left Kiri, the brunette replied carefully, silently berating himself for allowing his enthusiasm to take over. He was used to being calm and collected, but after so many months of trying to progress in his quest and being stymied by the Oinin, true progress was an exciting thing, especially after his near failure earlier that day. Just because this shinobi's first action wasn't to kill him didn't mean that Utakata wanted to press his luck. Still, honesty was the best policy, not to mention the most likely way to forge an alliance. The Mizuki's being controlled by someone who's looking to capture all the Jinchuriki and take our Bijū. He felt the kunai pull away from his throat, just a little. Apparently he'd piqued the older man's curiosity. Why? Good question. No idea. I left before I could find out. But if we could band together. The Iwanin barked a rusty laugh, fully withdrawing his blade from Utakata's throat and standing to his full height. Band together? Are ya mad? Utakata struggled into a sitting position, wincing as the injury from Kushimaru's sword protested the movement. Now that he was upright and the rock shinobi was distanced from him, he could finally see the older man in his entirety. A purplish, long-sleeved shirt and pants were worn loose on his short frame, form-fitting mesh armor with black sleeves visible at the chest and wrists. Worn leather armor protected his chest and stomach, flaps hanging from the waist to cover his thighs. At first glance, he looked like a warrior from a time long past. Listen, this person can control a kage, and he's got an organization of shinobi on the level of Hoshigaki Kisame looking. Who? Utakata blinked. Hoshigaki Kisame. One of the strongest members of Kiri's 7 shinobi swordsmen. One of the only ones left, too, he mused idly. At the other male's raised eyebrow, Utakata shook his head in disbelief. How have you not heard of Kisame? He's infamous. The redhead scowled at him. Boy, I've been out here fair longer than you've been alive, and I don't get much in way o news. I'm called Yotan no Rashi and I'm infamous, too, but I bet ya ain't heard o me. Utakata frowned. Well, no, but... Rashi nodded, cause sacrifices Jinchuriki ain't talked about but in cruel whispers. That's why I left. Utakata found that he couldn't argue with that logic. His own life back in the hidden mist supported the redhead's words well enough. Still, this was the first break he'd gotten since leaving his village, and to just give up because this other Jinchuriki was stubborn and ill-informed about current events was throwing away a golden opportunity. Okay, maybe you don't recognize some of the prominent names of today, but you can't really think you can fight whoever Akatsuki is. Akatsuki? Rashi interjected. Yeah, said nothing about Akatsuki. The brunette fought back his irritation at the continued interruptions before he'd finished his thought, now more intrigued that he'd gotten Roshi's attention, as well as any additional information he could glean from him. "You know about Akatsuki?" admitted the older Jinchuriki, his lips twisting into a smirk, amusement and cynicism fighting for control. "Yeah, could say that." For the first time since their conversation had started, the redhead settled himself on a rock in front of the fire and placed the tip of his curved kunai in the flames, dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Akatsuki's a terrorist group fair hire to whoever wants m. Such a kid's been using m on and off fair years. I ain't seen m in action, but it said members re all S-class nuke neen. S-class terrorists, great." Well, that matched what he knew of Kisame's abilities and personality, so Roshi's knowledge was at least believable. He wished the redhead knew what Akatsuki's numbers or skill sets were, but at least he now had a generic plateau to reach. S-class shinobi, while scarce, were generally labeled as such due to kekei genkai or possession of some special power, normally a kenjutsu, though a weapon the likes of Samehada worked too, and were considered kage level. Utakata knew that he was S-class in name because of his status as a Jinchuriki, though his actual rank didn't quite measure up yet. Yagura, however, held and had earned the title. "You're sayin' that Akatsuki's after Jinchuriki? Seems that way." Utakata allowed his companion to muse in silence, deciding that pressuring the older man into helping him wouldn't achieve the desired result. Even if he wanted, and needed, the assistance of the remaining Jinchuriki, it didn't mean that they'd just go along with his idea. He was relying a little on their desire for self-preservation to sway them to his cause, but loyalty, arrogance, stubbornness, and a dozen other personality traits would have to not get in the way of that. Certainly, if a Jinchuriki had a strong enough tie to his village, and the feeling was reciprocated, then maybe the might of one of the 5 great shinobi nations could rebuff an attack by Akatsuki. But Utakata didn't have that luxury, especially with his village leader being controlled by the very people seeking to capture him, and if he was lucky, Roshi would join him. The way he spoke certainly indicated a strained relationship with the hidden rock, one that would advantage the brunette. "Say I believe ya," Roshi stated, breaking the Kirinine from his thoughts. "What's your plan?" "Find the other Jinchuriki," he replied. "Convince them to join us, and then when Akatsuki comes, we fight back. And rescue Yagura." "You're crazier than I am if ya think that'll work," the redhead told him, "and only thing I talk ter is rocks." Alarm at that admission froze the brunette. Desperately, he probed, "But what about your Bijū?" Roshi barked another laugh of mocking amusement. "Ha! Me and Yanbi came ter an understandin' long ago, and it dawn involve speakin'." Utakata felt his heart plummet. He'd been operating under the assumption that most villages would have trained their Jinchuriki in a manner similar to how he and Yagura had been raised in the Hidden Mist, as weapons with the capacity to, eventually, access their Bijū's chakra and transformations. Unlike the Mizukage, who had successfully brought the Sanbai's power under his command, Utakata could only utilize part of the Rokubi's power, and even then, only with Seiken's permission, and it sounded like Roshi's relationship with the Four Tails hadn't even gotten to that point despite his significant time with the creature. If the Jinchuriki couldn't access the full power of their Bijū, and that was one of the things the brunette had planned on practicing, could they even defeat Akatsuki? Still, he'd come up with his plan on the fly, while not in the best mindset, so a fresh perspective might spark something new. He sighed. "Well, do you have a better suggestion?" "Course not, I only just heard about all this," Roshi rebutted. "But you're speakin' with desperation, and that's just stupid." "Workin' with other Jinchuriki," he scoffed. "Nobody likes a Jinchuriki, not even another Jinchuriki." "That's not true," Utakata snapped, temper surfacing at the unintended slight to his and Yagura's friendship. Roshi's dark eyes narrowed on him with suspicion. "Boy, yeah, Dawn, know just how true it is." Then, before the brunette could retort, the Iwanine stood up and stretched, the cracking of his vertebrae echoing loudly in the stillness of the evening. "But I'll tag along." Utakata's surprise stilled his question about why Roshi was so sure of his opinions on Jinchuriki. "You will?" "Sure. Been a long time since I got to tell someone, told yes so. We'll head out when you're strong enough to move on your own." "I ain't your nurse." Utakata scowled as Roshi covered the fire with earth, his rusty chuckles of amusement grating to the brunette's ears. "Just take the win," he told himself. His journey had finally borne fruit, but it appeared ready to drop and fallow at a moment's notice. He would have to proceed with caution going forward. Most of Rashi's distrust of people stemmed from the fact that his nation had turned its back on him simply because he'd become a Jinchuriki, and not by his own choice either. Not that anyone would choose that path, but the point remained. Of course, he'd also grown up in a time when the threat of war was constant, and Mu, an advocate of backstabbing and selfishness, could spy with no one the wiser, so it was no surprise that the redhead had little faith in people. The decades he'd spent in isolation probably didn't help either. Even still, there was something off about the boy, Utakata, he'd finally learned, he was traveling with. His Jinchuriki status and missing hideate suggested the Kirinine story possessed at least some elements of credibility. After all, the Bijū had been sought by people, and then nations by the time they'd become well known, since the first Hokage had initially handed out the few he'd managed to capture, and ever since, they'd been used as weapons to aid, and prolong, war. The fact that an organization like Akatsuki sought to commandeer them for its own purposes wasn't all that surprising, but the brunette's story had holes in it, the most prominent being his misplaced confidence that one Jinchuriki could get along with another. Rashi knew one other demon container personally and had fought against another over the course of Iwa's involvement in the Third Shinobi World War. What interaction he'd had with them suggested that their isolation had allowed them to thrive, in a morbid sort of way. Both, in fact, had wanted nothing more than to kill him. One had already failed, the other was probably still trying to figure out how to do so. Rashi's self-imposed exile was a testament to just how far a Jinchuriki would go to remove himself from society, to get away from the hatred and disgust that even their own kind couldn't sympathize with. He only knew of one person who didn't see him as a monster, and she didn't know of his burden. Dark eyes stared hard at the teenager's back, scrutinizing him for clues. "What are ya hidin', HM?" So, he began as they walked across the land of Earth's vast wasteland. "Where are we going?" "Konoha," Utakata replied, "unless you have a better idea." "I'm just followin' your lead," the redhead pointed out, "slow as it is." Utakata spared the older Jinchuriki an annoyed glare at the jab. Likely a byproduct of his solitude, Rashi's social interactions left much to be desired, which was saying something, coming from him, though the brunette knew that he had to play nice and suffer through his companion's potshots or risk losing his company altogether. Despite that, he had at least acquiesced to the bubble user's request to sear his wound closed so they could get moving right away, though the pace was a slog compared to how quickly shinobi normally traveled, even with the aid of Nuabari as a walking stick. Smoothing his features into a more diplomatic expression, he said, "I'd welcome your opinions. This is supposed to be a team effort. Two people don't make a team," Rashi argued, especially when they just met. "You don't trust me," Utakata stated after a moment. "Course not." "Dia trust me?" "No." At Rashi's raised eyebrow, he continued, "I'm not an idiot." "Could have fooled me," grumbled the redhead. "But I'm trying to see the bigger picture. Yes, we're strangers, and yes, we're from different villages, but we're both Jinchuriki, and I need your help. And whether you admit it or not, you need mine." He ignored Rashi's derisive grunt, instead hobbling over to the nearest rock and sitting down with a sigh. The Iwanin's dark eyes followed his movements, arms crossed over his chest. "So, what do you want to know? Which one do ya have? The Rokubi no Namakuji. And, your powers?" Instead of responding, Utakata withdrew his bamboo bubble blower, dunked it in his jug of solution, and then blew. A handful of bubbles escaped the weapon's opening, and the older Jinchuriki's eyes followed their path as they rose into the air before a snap of the brunette's fingers had them explode. "Bubbles, eh?" Rashi mused, one hand stroking his beard. "Kinda wimpy." "That all? I can also control the acidity and alkalinity of liquids. And I know a fair amount of Suetun ninjutsu. Why'd ya leave Kiri? I already told you, Akatsuki is controlling the Mizukage too." "Hunt down Jinchuriki," so ya said, Rashi interrupted with a flippant wave of his hand. "But you're tellin' me that no one else in Kiri can tell Mizukage's being controlled? Do I look daft to ya?" When Utakata hesitated in responding, the Iwanin's dark eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Dawn, try ter pull wool over my eyes, boy, you're way too young ter get away with it." After a moment, the former Kirinine replied, "The Mizukage, Yagura, he's my friend." Rashi let out a cruel bark of laughter. "I already told ya, Jinchuriki Dawn have friends. We're friends," Utakata asserted fiercely, golden eyes narrowed in challenge, "and he's also a Jinchuriki." Rashi blinked in surprise. Jinchuriki were, almost, always connected to a village's kage in some fashion in order to retain a tether of loyalty, or at least a facsimile of such, but they never became Kages themselves. Utakata continued, Yagura's the Jinchuriki of the Sanbai no Kaede game, and he's able to control the Sanbai's power completely. That's why no one in Kiri is suspicious. No one thinks anyone can control someone who can control a Bijū. Plus, whoever's controlling Yagura has one of the members of the 7 shinobi swordsmen on his side, and no one questions the swordsman. The Yonbi Jinchuriki remained silent in the wake of Utakata's revelations. He knew all too well of the fallacies associated with those who were seen as infallible, and while the boy's story now made more sense in some respect, it also implied far more danger. If whoever was in control of Akatsuki could manipulate a Kage who was also a Jinchuriki, what kind of power did that person wield? Utakata seemed to believe that the power of the combined Jinchuriki would be enough to resist Akatsuki, but that plan hinged on bringing together the demon containers. Maybe the former Kirinin had befriended his fellow Jinchuriki, but that made him the exception, not the rule. Like most Iwa nin, Rashi was as obstinate as the rocks he manipulated, and experience had taught him that Jinchuriki didn't work together. Yeah, realize that you're trying to ally a bunch of shinobi from different villages, right? Of course. I told you, I'm not an idiot. It'll never work. Jinchuriki were made to fight each other. Even Jinchuriki from same village won't work together. Utakata smiled thinly. We're working together right now. Rashi nickered a skeptical breath, a short laugh of disdain. Is that what you think this is? Utakata stared up at the older male through the bangs covering his eye. I just gave you evidence that 2 Jinchuriki from the same village can become friends. Ya told me a story, what ya did. There ain't no evidence. And you still don't believe me, which means, you probably have some experience to the contrary. Golden eyes narrowed in suspicion. You're not Iwa's only Jinchuriki, are you? Rashi scowled. He hated to admit it, but the boy was intuitive, even if his plan had no chance of working. No. The brunette jumped to his feet, wincing as his side protested the action. Then we should go find him. You can convince him to come with us. Ain't happening. But we need him. Utakata protested. Rashi's features were stone, dark eyes unflinching. Ain't happening, he repeated, tone brooking no argument. I told ya, nobody likes a Jinchuriki, not even another Jinchuriki. Maybe it's different fair ya, but everywhere else, that's how it works. Sides, I ain't convinced that this ideal work, so there ain't no way I'm puttin' myself in danger less I see an actual reason to do so. Utakata released a growl of frustration, but then allowed the subject to drop. Given their current situation, he would be better off not antagonizing his only ally. Fine. Can we keep going then? Rashi blinked, a genuine expression of confusion overtaking his dark features. You're not gonna ask me anything, would you answer if I did? Silence was his only response, and Utakata nodded. Thought not. You'll either tell me in time or I'll figure it out. In the meantime, I'd like to keep moving. His fellow Jinchuriki shrugged. You're one who stopped. They walked along in silence for several minutes before Rashi asked, why Konoha? How much history do you know? The redhead shrugged again. Things I did, Mosley. When ya live as I do, rest world don't really matter. Utakata sighed before saying, about 12 years ago, the Kyubi attacked Konoha. And, Yondaime Hokage died. The brunette stared at his companion, surprise clear in his wide eyes. Rashi stared flatly back. When a shinobi as big as Yellow Flash dies, don't think word spreads? Iwa hates him. So yeah, think there's a Jinchuriki in Konoha. Makes sense, the renegade Kirinin replied, walking his companion through his logic. The story goes that the Yondaime Hokage killed the Kyubi. Rashi snorted to show what he thought of the tale. Utakata nodded. My thought exactly. When I left Kiri, I knew the locations of 3 other Jinchuriki for certain, and I didn't think going to Kyumo was the best idea. Why? Kyumo's always been pretty militaristic, and I didn't think I'd be received well there. But I figured Konoha must have had at least the Kyubi out of the missing Bijū, so that's how I decided. So Kiri's got 2, Iwa's got 2, Kyumo's got 2? Rashi ascertained, ticking the numbers off on his fingers. At Utakata's nod, he continued, Konoha has 1. Suna's got at least 1, and last one's either in Konoha or Suna. Or unsealed. Rashi snorted again. Right. Everyone scooped up Bijū fast as they could. Can't let all that power go wasted. But yeah, Utakata finished, ignoring his companion's snark. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, realize that Kyubi Jinchūriki's probably just a kid, right? Maybe your age at oldest. The Kirinin opened his mouth to respond and then closed it. Truthfully, in his desperation to escape the hidden mist and the hunter Nin, he hadn't given consideration to the Kyubi Jinchūriki's age, despite assuming that the fox had been sealed roughly a decade prior. Due to their very nature as chakra given animal form, there were limits on when the Bijū could be sealed. Babies and young children whose chakra coils weren't fully developed and had the potential to grow into the massive chakra they would inherit were the only real choices for a successful Jinchuriki. Doesn't matter, he finally replied. The Kyubi's the strongest of the Bijū, so having its Jinchuriki on our side would make a huge difference. Besides, Yagura became the Mizukage when he was 12, so age is irrelevant. He can also control Sanbai's power, according to Ya. I wouldn't use him as a measuring stick. He said nothing to that. It was good that he'd found Rashi, but the older man was turning out to be very pessimistic, even compared to Utakata's morose realism. When they reached Konoha and found the Kyubi Jinchuriki, everything would change. Hopefully. What's next? Utakata resisted the overwhelming urge to snap at his companion. Every step of their journey to Konoha had been sprinkled with little pieces of Rashi's commentary tinged with smug amusement, as if he felt personally vindicated at every blockade put in their path. First was his skepticism on how the bubble user planned on convincing the Jinchuriki to work together, then it was how to traverse the land of fire, which retained some measure of border security as they got closer to Konoha, and now that they'd reached the village proper, it was how they would proceed to find the Jinchuriki. Granted, Konoha was a big village, and it was a fair question, but between their resourcefulness, Rashi had used an earth technique to move them underground to bypass the barrier. The brunette figured they could come up with something. It didn't help his mood that, despite several attempts to convince Rashi to get Iwa's second Jinchuriki to join their cause, the older man had stubbornly refused to provide any additional assistance. Look for the Jinchuriki, cause it's just that simple, came the sarcastic response. You said it yourself, Utakata pointed out, he's within a certain age range. Check the academy, or the training grounds, or somewhere a young shinobi would go. And if he's on a mission? Rashi argued. We could just be wasting our time. Then we wait. Do you have something better to do? The redhead grunted, but made no other noise of dissent. Utakata smirked to himself. That's what I thought. In the meantime, we search. Konoha's size aside, it didn't take long to find the Shinobi Academy, and they passed the time waiting for the kids to be let out in silence. Utakata had discovered that Rashi's exile made him comfortable with prolonged bouts of quiet, despite how opinionated he was when it came to certain topics. While Utakata didn't mind the silence, given his own social reticence, he also knew that if the Jinchuriki were to learn to work together, communication was required. And while Utakata could talk to Yagura, he didn't have the same level of comfort around the Iwa Nin. Uchiha, nobody, Yamanaka, Rashi muttered, startling the bubble user. What are you doing? Rashi jerked his head toward the academy, where students were now flowing out. Katalogan. Pink hair. Nobody, Nara, Akimichi. Utakata blinked in surprise. His missions hadn't led him through the land of fire, and Rashi seemed like too much of a hermit to have any sort of knowledge relating to what he could only presume was clan affiliation. How? Know your enemy, came the gruff reply. He pointed towards the first boy out. That style O shirt, with upturned collar, that's what Uchiha clan wears. He moved on to a girl with long, platinum blonde hair tied in a high ponytail. Hair color O Yamanaka clan. Nara hairstyle, Akimichi body, Aburame clothing, Inazuka facial tattoos, he continued, indicating more children in turn. Rest O ain't from any big clan. Utakata was already nodding in acceptance of Rashi's classifications of Konoha's up-and-coming shinobi, so when the older man cut himself off abruptly, the brunette figured his companion had seen his understanding and allowed his analysis to stop. But when the redhead uttered something in as close to a tone of disbelief as the renegade mist shinobi had heard thus far, he prompted, sorry, what? Namikaze, Rashi whispered, his voice a mixture of shock and fear. Utakata frowned. Namikaze, as in the Yondaime Hokage? Dia no any other Namikaze? Rashi snapped. No. Where are you looking? The Iwa Nin pointed, and golden eyes followed the direction to a boy with spiky yellow hair and crystal blue eyes trailing the crowd. Despite the exotic combination, the most intriguing feature of the boy was a set of prominent whisker-like markings, 3 on each cheek. Are you sure? I've never heard of the Yondaime Hokage having a son. Not that he knew much of the man beyond his reputation, Kirigakure preferred to boast about its own history, not that of other nations. Rashi fixed him with the most serious look Utakata had seen on the redhead. Boy, if yet seen him mow down an army shinobi, yet never forget what he looked like either. Sides, he continued, turning back to scrutinize the blonde, whiskers, so he noticed, too. You think that's his mark? A fox, right? At Utakata's hum of assent, Rashi nodded. That's my guess. And, since most Jinchuriki related to their kage, being Namikaze's son makes sense. Utakata nodded. Fair enough. Let's follow him, he urged, grabbing Rashi's sleeve and tugging on it. The older Jinchuriki yanked himself from the brunette's grip with a violent jerk but followed his companion anyway, grumbling at the teen's pushiness. They trailed the blonde child to a playground that immediately emptied upon the boy's presence. Utakata nudged the redhead at that development, and Rashi scowled at his companion's eagerness. The visual of people starkly avoiding the Namikaze child was just another line of evidence that he was Konoha's Jinchuriki, and he didn't need Utakata's enthusiasm to remind him of the shitty life their kind led. So Yeba found him. Now what's your plan? He asked snidely. We need to talk to him in private. Can you use that Doton jutsu again? Rashi quirked an eyebrow, but began forming seals. Utakata forestalled him by shaking his head. Wait for me. He ran through his own hand seals, an intense look of concentration on his face. Rashi almost asked what his plan was, but decided to see what the younger male was doing without breaking his focus. So seamlessly that he was sure he would have missed it if he wasn't actively watching for something. A thin layer of liquid formed from the moisture in the air, creating a hemispherical bubble around the swing set the blonde child was on. Okay, go now. Rashi went through the seals for the earth release, underground projection fish technique once more, sinking through the earth and practically swimming through it as the technique's name suggested. Judging himself to be beneath the boy based on the slight vibrations of the swing set in the earth, he surfaced and immediately clasped one hand over the blonde's mouth and one around his torso before sinking back into the ground and heading for the forest surrounding the village proper. Utakata watched from the sidelines as Rashi crept up on the blonde boy and kidnapped him. As the caster, he could see through the bubble he'd placed over the swing set, though anyone else would only see what the genjutsu on the bubble's surface displayed. Maybe capturing their prospective ally wasn't the best way to endear themselves to him, but they needed to have a conversation away from prying eyes, and no matter how deserted the playground seemed, there was always the potential for mishaps. The bubble's surface showed the blonde getting up and walking away, and Utakata allowed a small detachment to break off and take on the shape of the Konoha child, a bubble clone wandering off in a direction that would hopefully avoid detection. That done, he left for the forest, hoping that Rashi had chosen an ideal rendezvous point. Chapter 3, The Fox's Dream. Hey, Hokage-ji-san, how come you're so nice to me? Well, it's the Hokage's duty to look after the people of Konoha. I watch over everyone, and in turn, the village prospers. So if I become Hokage, people will have to pay attention to me, right? 'Cause I'll be protecting them. A somber expression overtook the Hokage's face, saddened by the child's simplistic solution to a problem far beyond his comprehension. That may be an oversimplification, he placated. The Hokage must also be strong. But you're so old. He leveled a mock-affronted look at his companion. I'm not that old. Besides, with age comes wisdom and experience. I'll have you know I'm stronger than I look. Really? Well, then I'm gonna become even stronger than you so I can be Hokage. The Hokage chuckled, tousling the boy's already unruly blonde locks and earning a shout of protest. I look forward to that day, Naruto-kun. Today sucks. So what if he'd been late to class? He'd been busy training to become Hokage. It wasn't like he'd ever learned anything of use in the academy anyway, even though Irika insisted that everything he taught was super important. What use was math in the face of an awesome jutsu? But, Irika always argued, strategy counted for something. The size or power of a jutsu is meaningless if a shinobi is clever enough to escape or counter it, he'd say. That was why they always practiced the same 3 techniques over and over and over again, until Naruto had gotten so sick of the monotony that he'd just given up going to class to master them. That he still couldn't figure out how to produce a true bunshin didn't help his motivation either. It seemed like no matter how much chakra he used or how hard he focused, his clones always turned out half-formed and sickly. Hearing that he'd need to produce a passable clone to graduate from the academy had caused an uncomfortable knot in his stomach, a seed of despair that had bloomed into full growth with the call of his name. "I'm sorry, Naruto, but we can't pass you." Again had gone unspoken, though it hadn't changed the demoralizing weight that burdened his body. Watching his classmates meet their parents with new height displayed proudly on their foreheads had only reminded him of both his failure and his loneliness, and so he turned and left, heading for the solace of the local playground. Where everyone else was congratulated for their achievement, he wallowed in the despair of defeat. Allowing the gentle rocking motion of the swing to provide a tiny semblance of comfort, he took the silence to think about what would happen next. His classmates would progress to the next level of shinobi life while he was left in the dust for another year. Or maybe worse. Was there a punishment for those who had failed the graduation exam 3 times? Despite his continually terrible performance, he hadn't yet been removed from the academy. Although that may have been due to the support of the third Hokage, there was no way of telling, but maybe that was just because he hadn't yet failed 3 times. Things tended to work out in threes, the basic academy ninjutsu, strikes and stickball, points in an argument, so maybe the instructors had just been waiting for this moment to expel him. What if they won't let me be Hokage? A hand clamped over his mouth, muffling his yelp of surprise, and an arm wrapped around his torso. In the next instant, his vision was engulfed in darkness, and then, after what felt like hours, he could see again. He blinked in surprise as his vision returned. He was in the middle of the forest surrounded on all sides by towering trees. Dappled sunlight filtered down through the treetops, casting strange patterns against gnarled bark. Wow! Having never been outside of Konoha's Great Walls before, the sheer beauty of his surroundings was a welcome distraction from his current situation. It was as he was turning around in admiration that he spotted his presumed kidnapper standing several feet away. The man was short and clad in what Naruto thought were purple pajamas, with scruffy, bright red hair held in a top knot that matched his short beard and connecting mustache. Judging by his forehead protector, he was not from the Hidden Leaf. "Hey!" he shouted, feelings of peace suddenly shattered by a righteous anger. "You think you can get away with kidnapping the future Hokage, Uzumaki Naruto?" "Shut up, kid," grumbled the redhead, tone filled with bored disdain. Naruto was used to how people talked to or about him in the same manner, but combined with the day he'd had so far, the man's actions and condescension were the final straws. With the intent to show his kidnapper what for, he took 2 steps forward and then stumbled, letting out a surprised, "Wah?" As he did. A glance down revealed his feet encased up to the ankle in hard rock that hadn't been there a moment ago. "I'd stay put if I were ya," the redhead advised. Naruto returned his gaze to the older man to find him pulling his hands apart from a clasped position. The blonde reached into his kunai pouch and withdrew one of his blades to start breaking himself free of the rock, but the other male just laughed, almost cruelly, he thought, and said, "Don't waste your time, ya ain't gonna break out that." Not one to listen to the advice of others, Naruto continued stabbing at his restraints. After almost a minute of hacking, his kidnapper's gruff voice asked, "Uzumaki yes say?" Force of habit had the blonde stop to look up, gesture to his chest with his thumb, and boisterously reply, "Yeah." "Uzumaki Naruto, future Hokage." The redhead waved him off. I heard ya first time." "Not Namikaze, eh?" he muttered. "Who?" His kidnapper stared at him in what Naruto guessed was disbelief for a long moment before turning away, muttering incomprehensibly. The blonde let out an indignant huff before returning to the task of freeing himself. After another several minutes, the redhead grumbled, finally, and Naruto raised his head to look at what had driven him to speak. Floating towards them was a boy with shoulder-length brown hair, casually sitting cross-legged inside a bubble. He was clothed in a blue kimono, and Naruto guessed he was probably a teenager. Once he was close enough, the bubble popped, and the kimono-clad boy lit on his feet with dainty ease. Or it would have been if he didn't stumble the landing, a long, thin weapon digging into the ground and serving as a makeshift walking stick that kept the brunette, mostly, upright. Naruto was so amazed by his appearance that he'd stopped working on his escape and was fixated on the new arrival. He snapped out of his daze when the redhead barked a laugh. "Ain't ya graceful?" The brunette chose to ignore his companion's sarcasm, instead straightening his posture and offering a genial, "Nice job, Rashi." As far as I can tell, no one followed us, and we're pretty well hidden, he added, glancing around as if to accentuate this point. Naruto noticed he had a very calm way of talking, his voice even despite the praise he credited his accomplice. Though it might have just seemed that way in comparison to the redhead, who seemed as big a jerk as any of the people he'd run into in Konoha. Bah, don't matter, Rashi scoffed. Kid's a dud. Ain't even a Namikaze. A startled expression overtook the brunette's features. You said he was. Rashi shrugged. It was a guess. And he seems pretty stupid. Naruto decided he'd had enough of being ignored and insulted. Hey, you're talking about the future Hokage. Lemme go before I kick your ass. Loud, too, added the redhead dryly. You're sure he's not the Jinchuriki? I didn't ask, if that's what you're. Whatever you said. Both kidnappers turned to look at the blonde. The younger one cursed, his calm composure showing fractures. What's the likelihood that Konoha didn't tell its Jinchuriki that he's a Jinchuriki? He asked his companion. Slim to none, Rashi responded, raising his chin to scratch his beard. Strongest Bijū at their disposal and they ain't using him as a weapon. Seems unlikely, but everything else fit. His companion protested, the timbre of his voice cracking with emotion. He began ticking off his fingers. Solitary, disliked, connected to a high-ranking political figure. Which he ain't, Rashi interjected. I told ya it was a guess. Sides, ya said it yourself, Namikaze didn't have a son, and this damn idiot don't even know who he is. Just because we didn't hear of one doesn't mean he didn't have one. He's even got the marking. You're grappin' at straws. Just 'cause ya want him to be Jinchuriki don't mean he is. The blue-clad boy waved off his companion's words, receiving an eye roll in return, before turning to the blonde. Hello, Naruto, supplied the redhead. Then he muttered, stupid name. Naruto, repeated the teenager, who are your parents? Unable to move, and deciding that playing along might expedite his release, Naruto replied, Dunno. Never had any parents. His kidnappers exchanged glances before the brown-haired boy turned back to him and said, according to my friend here, Rashi scoffed again, you bear a striking resemblance to Namikaze Minato. Who? Rashi again muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, idiot. His companion turned to offer him a brief frown, and when he returned to speaking to Naruto, the expression remained etched on his face. Namikaze Minato, he repeated, you're Yondaime Hokage. Excitement bubbled within the blonde's chest, all his problems momentarily forgotten. I'm related to the Yondaime. It's possible. Bah, who cares? Rashi interrupted. Kid ain't who you're lookin' fair, and I ain't wastin' any more time here. He turned around and began to march away, the earth holding Naruto's feet in place crumbling away. There were a lot of things that irritated Naruto, but being blown off by people who thought they were better than him, his former classmate Sasuke tended to act like that in their spars, was near the top of that list. Given that Rashi had been nothing but condescending towards him during their entire interaction, the blonde decided to take advantage of the older man's blasé attitude while he had the opportunity and teach him a lesson. He rushed past the blue-clad teenager, who called out his name in a warning, and charged the redhead with his kunai, fully prepared to enact vengeance. He was caught by surprise when Rashi turned and delivered a vicious spin kick to his side, sending him rocketing into a thick tree trunk amidst a crunch of mangled bark. So, ya thought ya could pull a fast one on me, eh? The redhead stalked towards him, cracking his knuckles as he approached. You're too young to be thinkin' ya can take me on. Back off, boy, he barked when the brunette rushed closer in protest. Rashi, you can't. I can do what I want, Lesya suddenly turned into Tsuchikage. He returned his attention to Naruto even as he continued to address the blue-clad male. Ya want to see if he's Jinchuriki? This'll show if he's weapon they woulda trained him to be. Naruto rose from his slumped position with a groan and charged Rashi again, this time telegraphing a punch. The redhead effortlessly caught the fist in his hand and then brought his knee into the blonde's stomach, leaving him slumped over and wheezing for air. He slammed his elbow down on the boy's clavicle, laying him out flat on the ground, then stomped down with one foot. A rock jutted up from the earth and delivered a second blow to Naruto's stomach. The blonde dry heaved from where he lay. Rashi, that's enough. The redhead glowered at the brunette for a long moment before turning and walking away with a snort. Waste time. Now we have to leave, his companion reprimanded. We could have just separated peaceably, returned him back to the village, but now that you assaulted him, he'll tell the Hokage and Konoha will definitely be on the lookout for us. Humph, you're optimistic. They would come after us anyway. You're on your own, Rashi added, waving a hand in dismissal. I told ya this was a stupid idea, and Yevi still got nothing to show for it. We would have been able to keep looking if you hadn't lost your temper. I just told ya, there ain't no more if we. Naruto slowly rose to his feet as the two argued. Even Sasuke had never beaten him so thoroughly and viciously, and now he was both pissed and humiliated. Hey, Aji-san, he gasped, I'm not done yet. Rashi turned around and graced the blonde with one of the most scornful expressions he'd ever seen, as if the finger he was pointing determinately at the older man was a particularly bad joke. From his periphery, Naruto could see the other boy staring at him with something akin to awe on his features, probably amazed at his tenacity, or sheer awesomeness, either was a possibility. He brought his fingers into the ram seal and announced, Oiroku no Jutsu. Smoke enveloped his body briefly, only to dissipate and leave a taller, well-endowed, naked, female blonde with pigtails in his place. He blew a kiss at Rashi, a sensual invitation designed to derive a reaction from him like he had from the normally straight-laced Irika. From the corner of his eye, Naruto spied the brown-haired boy determinedly looking away. Whatever he had expected to happen, it never came to pass. Rashi's dark eyes narrowed into an approximation of obsidian chips, his hands fisted at his sides and anger shaking his body. Ya call that ninjutsu? He roared, hands flying through seals. What self-respectin' shinobi falls for something so stupid? This is ninjutsu. Rashi, don't. Yotan, Yanami. Utakata couldn't find the words to express the disappointment flooding his veins. He'd had such high hopes that the blonde child Rashi had been so certain was the Namikaze heir was also the Kyuubi Jinchuriki that he hadn't even taken a moment to question the alternative. Even in their short window of observation, there had been enough mirrored similarities to his and Rashi's lives as Jinchuriki that the likelihood of the boy not being the fox's container was astronomical. But fate seemed to have him slated for failure, his enthusiastic haste overwhelming the common-sense decision to actually confirm their suspicions. Now they had more than just circumstantial evidence, and given Naruto's general lack of knowledge and skill, it was hard to deny that the boy didn't seem all that likely a Jinchuriki candidate anymore. The hidden villages of Mist and Rock had pressed their Jinchuriki into becoming weapons as soon as they were capable, sooner in some cases. If Konoha, which possessed the strongest of the Bijū, hadn't, well, the bubble user couldn't think of anything more surprising than not using all available resources to their fullest potential. Despite that, he admired the boy's strength of character. If nothing else, getting up after Rashi had delivered such a swift and brutal beatdown was impressive. Foolhardy, given how badly the redhead outclassed the boy, but admirable nonetheless. But now the blonde was far more likely to tell Konoha's superiors about his kidnapping, thus delaying his own plans to find and sway the true Jinchuriki to his side. The fact that he'd apparently used up Rashi's tolerance on this mission was just another failure that he'd have to try and fix, and quickly. Oiroku no Jutsu. Utakata glanced over at the blonde's shout and then quickly averted his eyes, embarrassed at the sight that greeted him. Naruto's transformation ploy was valid, he supposed, given that much of mankind would fall for something so enticing. He'd certainly walked past Kiri's red light district enough times to notice man's folly in that regard, but to use it against someone who had lived the life he, and Rashi, judging by redhead's shouting, was misguided. So stupid. This is ninjutsu. He became aware of Rashi's intention just a little too late, spinning around and forming seals even as he instinctively yelled, Rashi, don't. The water release, wild water wave he was preparing would never make it in time to counter the stream of lava. Rashi can use Yotan? That had left the redhead's mouth, and Naruto didn't have the wherewithal gained from experience to dodge the ninjutsu in time. The blonde held up his hands in a futile movement to protect himself from the technique, and the lava split and flowed around them like it had hit an invisible barrier. Utakata swallowed the chakra he'd prepared and stared in shock. Even Rashi was caught flat-footed, letting out a surprised, eh? At the situation. What's going on? Lava manipulation wasn't completely unheard of. There was a clan in the Land of Water whose members were sometimes born with the ability to utilize either it or steam ninjutsu, though, as far as he knew, they'd been eliminated in the bloodline purges, but like most Kekkei Genkai, it was rare. Utakata hadn't even known there were people outside the Land of Water who could use lava elemental chakra until this moment, and given its rarity, it was probably the ability granted to him by the Four Tails. The odds of finding someone else who could do it, especially within a third hidden village, were astronomical. It's not so strange if he is the Kyuubi Jinchuriki. Utakata flinched at the unseen voice, a startled, "What?" escaping his lips and drawing a dark look from Rashi. After being his only companion for the long months he'd been gone from the hidden mist, Saiken had been silent since he'd met Rashi. The slug's burbling, boyish voice was welcome, if surprising, though the way he delivered that tidbit of information sounded almost bitter. "What do you mean? The Kyuubi's power is different. While the rest of us Bijū are a physical manifestation of some aspect of the natural world, the Kyuubi is more. All. Humans describe him as a natural disaster because they cannot fathom his ability to manipulate all the different components of the natural world. Just because he can use our powers, he thinks he can lord it over us." Ah! Now the bubble user understood the slug's bitterness. To have the powers you prided yourself on usurped by another and potentially perverted against you sounded as aggravating as it was dangerous. Despite that, Utakata felt a swell of excitement bubble within him again. Saiken had essentially confirmed it. Naruto was the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. On the one hand, it was a relief to know that he and Rashi hadn't made a mistake in targeting the blonde, but on the other, Naruto was not at all what he'd expected when he'd started his mission. The bubble user had been a Jonin by age 14, and Yagura had been appointed Mizukage the same year. Given the way Rashi talked, it probably wasn't too far a stretch to assume that his history wasn't all that different from that of the two Miss Jinchuriki. He walked over to the scowling Rashi, grabbed his arm, and pulled him out of the blonde's earshot. "He's the Kyuubi Jinchuriki," Rashi scoffed. "What, just 'cause he can use Yotan? Saiken told me he can use the powers of the other Bijū." When Rashi's eyebrows furrowed in skeptical incomprehension, Utakata sighed and prompted, "The Rokubi?" The redhead nodded, though the gesture gave Utakata the distinct impression that he was being patronized. "Ah, right, you're friends with your Bijū. Are you listening to me?" he demanded. "He can copy the abilities of the other Bijū." "We found him." Rashi raised an eyebrow. "And? Did ya see him fight? He's useless. Don't even know what he is." "Medya found him, good job," he added sarcastically, "but he ain't trained." Utakata was silent for a long moment, digesting his companion's words. Rashi hadn't said anything that wasn't true or that he himself hadn't seen with his own eyes, but the strength of the Kyuubi couldn't be ignored. Naruto's abilities also provided a solid basis for potentially finding the other Jinchuriki via pseudo-osmosis, as much of a long shot as that was. "We need to take advantage of this opportunity. We'll train him," he decided. Rashi spared him a flat look. "No. Why not? He's stupid, ain't even a genin, and I ain't wastin' my time helpin' some Konoha brat," spat the redhead. "Do you have something better to do?" Rashi could only scowl at the question, and so Utakata admitted, "This isn't exactly my ideal situation either." "You think I want to be stuck here training someone from scratch?" He thought briefly of Hataru, and how he'd rewarded her hospitality by dashing her hopes of being trained to be a kunoichi. "This is different," he told himself. "We need the Kyuubi on our side. For Yagura. It's not like I've ever trained someone either." "Who said I ain't trained someone?" The Iwanin snapped. Utakata blinked in surprise, everything he'd learned about his companion contrary to the idea of being a mentor to someone. Deciding that it was better not to pursue that line of questioning while the older Jinchuriki was still riled up, he gently pressed, "Look, he's got no one else, and we need all the help we can get. At least if we train him, we know it'll get done right, even if we have to do it from the beginning. Plus, he's got our abilities. Who else is better suited to train him? Besides," he added, almost as an afterthought, "you know that you can't take on Akatsuki by yourself." "I still have a village," Rashi argued, though the bite in his voice sounded like it had dulled, just a little. He placed his right hand in his pocket and appeared to squeeze something there for several seconds before grunting, "Fine, have it your way. I'll stay." "You will?" "That worked, but ya can't interfere with how I train him, got it?" The brunette immediately nodded his assent, relief at his success evident in the slouching of his shoulders. "Just don't go overboard," he said before walking over to where Naruto had collapsed in apparent shell shock. Softly, as to not startle him, the Kirinin said the boy's name, garnering his wide-eyed attention. "Sorry about all of this. My name's Utakata, you've already met Rashi." "Stupid old man," the blonde grumbled, his normal feistiness returning to him. "Idiot brat." "Yes, Well. Utakata interjected awkwardly, unsure how to break the disdain brewing between the pair. We clearly got off on the wrong foot, but contrary to what you might believe, we're not here to hurt you. If you'd allow us, we'd like to train you to become a better shinobi. Naruto's crystal blue eyes were suddenly alight with wild enthusiasm. He jumped to his feet in excitement. Really? Utakata nodded. Yes. We're like you, Naruto. Jinchuriki. Humans who contain the power of the Bijū, he elaborated at the blonde's confused expression. Are ya gonna tell him all our secrets? Rashi interjected snidely. He needs to trust us, the brunette replied, sparing his companion a flat look, and since you decided to try cooking him, well, desperate times. He graced Naruto with a gentle smile. Sorry about that. As I was saying, we're all Jinchuriki. I have the Rokubi, Rashi has the Yanbi. He hesitated before continuing, not sure how the boy would react to such a bombshell, then continued on, and you contain the Kyubi. But, the Yondaime killed the Kyubi. Rashi let out a cruel bark of laughter. Ha! And, yeah, believe that crap. The Kuririn shot the older male a warning look. Rashi grunted, annoyed at the silent reprimand, but said nothing else. Utakata found himself grateful, and hopeful, that the redhead was actually obeying his silent directives. To Naruto, he gently explained, that's merely a story that was made up to cover what really happened. The Bijū can't be killed. From what I've heard of his reputation, the Yondaime Hokage was a sealing genius. It's likely that he was able to seal the Kyubi inside you. But, why me? The brunette hesitated again before slowly replying, well, we can't know any of this for sure, but Jinchuriki typically aren't chosen at random. In order to ensure their loyalty, they're normally connected in some respect to their village's kage or leadership. According to Rashi, you bear a strong resemblance to the Yondaime, so it's possible that you're his son. Naruto's expression, which had grown progressively more somber as the bubble user's explanations had dragged on, flipped back to excited with impressive alacrity. Really? So you weren't lying earlier? That's awesome. Utakata watched the blonde with a critical eye as he considered how to proceed. He'd never met someone like Naruto, who seemed to take everything in stride and bounced back from bad news like he was elastic. It was unnerving in a way. The brunette was used to dealing with the suspicious but straight-shooting people of Kiri, and he'd even started adjusting to Rashi's mocking skepticism, tolerance for it notwithstanding. But Naruto hadn't gone through the same type of training, being raised as a weapon, even as it seemed like he'd dealt with the typical backlash associated with being a Jinchuriki, and thus their mindsets were apparently quite different. That they'd all been raised in separate villages with varying societal and cultural outlooks probably didn't help either. I wish I could tell if his unique persona is good for us or not. He once again drew the younger boy's attention with a single utterance of his name. When Blue Eyes focused on him, he said, you can't tell anyone about any of this. Or us. How come? He's disappointed again. He's far too transparent. If no one's told you any of this before, there's probably a reason. Probably not a good one, Rashi grumbled. Utakata continued as if he hadn't been interrupted, even if he agreed with the sentiment. Your relationship to the Yondaime Hokage might not even be real, we don't know. But if you told people, it would raise suspicion about how you came across information you're not supposed to know. As for us. He shot a glance at Rashi before saying, it's generally frowned upon to have contact with foreigners. Konoha wouldn't react well if anyone knew that you're talking with us. Especially Rashi. Konoha's history with the Hidden Rock was well documented, but given the extent, or lack thereof, of the youngest Jinchuriki's education, it was possible he wasn't aware of the tension between the two villages. If that's the case, I'm not going to be the one to tell him. Naruto almost looked to be pouting, but then his expression soured. Not like there's anyone to tell, he muttered, scuffing the ground with his shoe. The Kuririn offered the boy a wan smile. I know. We know. But I'm just telling you as a precaution, you can't tell anyone about us. We'll find a way to meet with you without attracting undue attention, but you'll have to do your part as well. Maybe couching it as training will help. A good shinobi knows how to keep secrets. Do you think you can do that? Naruto's head bobbed up and down with such vigorous enthusiasm Utakata thought he might give himself whiplash. Good. Then we'll see you tomorrow. We're not gonna start now. Well. We'll start now, Rashi interrupted, cracking his knuckles and moving towards the younger pair. Rashi. Yeah, said, yet let me do it my way. Utakata fell silent, acquiescing to the older Jinchūriki's subtle warning. Sides, we need to see what we're dealing with. He returned his attention to Naruto. So, what can ya do? Naruto glared back, but at Utakata's nod, he relaxed a fraction and put his hands in a familiar seal. Oiroke, none o' that. Rashi barked. Ya ain't usin' that jutsu no more. Don, tell me ya don know nothin' else? The blonde lowered his hands and crossed his arms, scowling at the Iwa Nin. I can do Kawarimi and Henge, too. The redhead snorted. Who can't? What else? A flush colored Naruto's cheeks, his teeth grit together in anger. I can also make a bunshin. Kinda. How do you kind of make a bunshin? And that's all? Rashi asked again. Konoha's gotten weak. Like learnin' bunshin's gonna help ya in a fight. Naruto graced the redhead with a look that warred between skepticism and hope. Really? I don't need to know how to make a bunshin. Are you not going to elaborate on how you kind of make a bunshin? You'll learn how to make a bunshin, Rashi asserted, it'll just be a useful one. Tsuchi, probably, and he can probably teach ya Mizu, he added, jerking his thumb at Utakata, who threw his hands in the air and mumbled something about being ignored. The redhead's lips quirked, a momentary flicker of amusement at the brunette's expense. Naruto, watching the older man with rapt attention, caught the gesture. For a second, the redhead's gruff exterior disappeared, and in that moment, he almost seemed human, more than the hatred and irritation that radiated from his body like the warmth of the sun. Maybe he's not so bad. After all, Rashi was willing to train the blonde, and he didn't even care that he couldn't perform the clone technique, the one thing which had held him back from becoming a leaf shinobi in the first place. What are ya looking at? The blonde crossed his arms, turning his head and closing his eyes so he was no longer looking at the older man. Nothin', he muttered. He's still a jerk. A closed fist striking the back of his head had him whirling on the spot, a snarl on his lips. Rashi's narrow-eyed stare greeted him. Respect your elders, brat, he criticized. Oh yeah. Okay, Utakata interjected, stepping between the pair and placing them both at arm's length. They continued to shoot daggers at each other around the brunette's billowing kimono, and he realized that he was the tallest of the trio. I'll take whatever advantage I've got. Like I was saying, let's call it a day for now. Rashi snorted, but this time didn't override the teenager's suggestion. Great. Naruto, a word? He hobbled out of the redhead's earshot, the blonde following at a sedate pace. Golden eyes darted over to where Rashi was standing, blue eyes followed the movement, scowling in the purple-clad man's direction as one hand came up to rub at the spot he'd been hit. Does it hurt? No, Naruto mumbled with just a tinge of embarrassment. Just, stupid. The brunette placed a hand upon the younger boy's shoulder. I know it's tough, really, I do, but you should try to get along with Rashi. He'll be teaching you as much as I will. Naruto crossed his arms over his chest, lips twisting into a pout as if to protest what he thought of that idea. Why can't you just teach me? I will be, the Kirin assured him, but as you may have noticed, Rashi's quite strong. He's definitely stronger than me. If you want to learn how to be a strong shinobi, you'll need to listen to him. There was a long moment of silence in which the blonde seemed to be weighing his options before finally grumbling, fine. Utakata spared him a weak smile of gratitude, which the leaf native tentatively returned. Thank you. Then he turned his attention to the Iwa Nin and asked in a louder voice, Rashi, can you take him back? Are ya giving me a choice? At the Miss Jinchuriki's unchanging expression, the redhead growled and walked over. Fine. Unbidden, he placed a heavy hand on the blonde's shoulder, a too strong grip that caused the boy to flinch. Then they sank into the ground. Utakata stared at the spot they'd disappeared in silence. Until tomorrow, Naruto. The journey back into Konoha proper was much less disorienting the second time around, probably because Naruto actually knew what was happening. They surfaced from the earth within a thicket of trees that the blonde hoped was somewhere within the village. Rashi immediately released him and shoved him away. Playground's over there, he grunted, pointing in the direction of the thinning tree line. Meet here tomorrow morning. Make sure you're not followed. Naruto crossed his arms in an act of defiance and petulantly muttered, Utakata already said not to let anyone know about you guys. Well, I'm remindin', yeah, Rashi snapped. You've already proven you're a stupid brat, ya probably don't listen to what you're told. The blonde opened his mouth to argue, but then Utakata's words about getting along with the older man resurfaced, and he shut it before any words could escape. I'll be careful, he promised, tone trite but sincere. Rashi appeared taken aback at his abrupt change in attitude, but quickly schooled his features back into the scowl that seemed a permanent fixture of his face. Chen. We'll see. Then he disappeared back into the ground, and Naruto was once again alone. Still, despite the solitude, the blonde found his cheeks spreading into a wide grin. It no longer mattered that he'd failed out of the academy, because Utakata had promised he and Rashi would train him to be a shinobi. A great shinobi, like the Yondaime Hokage. My dad! Naruto began the walk to his apartment with a new spring in his step, one fist pumping the air. I'm gonna be the next Hokage for sure, believe it.